I woke up after 11 days in a coma and found out I had been erased from the very company I built. My name vanished from all legal documents. My assets were transferred through a contract with a signature I never wrote. My husband and my best friend, the woman I called sister, told the world I was mentally unfit. They pushed me out with silence. And when I traced every clue, I realized they didn't just steal my company. They planned this for years. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next gut-wrenching, truth-packed chapters we bring. They told me I'd been asleep for 11 days. I opened my eyes to sterile light, faint antiseptic, and the rhythm of a heart monitor that wasn't mine. The ceiling tiles above me didn't move, but the room swayed like water. My arms were stiff. IV lines trailed from bruised skin like strings that tethered me to a version of myself I didn't recognize. My mouth tasted like copper and dreams. I blinked once, then again hoping it would all dissolve into a different reality. But it didn't. The voice came from my left. Low-controlled professional. She's responding. Vitals stable. Another voice closer. Warmer, familiar, but hollow. Don't push her too hard, she's been through a lot. I turned my head slowly, painfully. Marcus stood beside the bed. Perfectly pressed blazer, no tie, calm eyes. A hand rested lightly on the guardrail, too lightly like it wasn't his first instinct. He smiled when he saw me look. Not relief, not love, recognition. "You're awake," he said softly, like it was both a surprise and a complication. My throat burned when I tried to speak. No words came, just a cough that made my ribs scream. Marcus leaned in. "Don't try to talk, Alina, just rest. You've been in an accident." The car flipped. "You're lucky to be alive." I tried to ask, what day, what happened, but my body wouldn't obey. The doctor spoke next. "She's stable, but we need to monitor for any signs of disorientation or delayed trauma. It's not uncommon after this type of head injury." Marcus nodded. "Of course, whatever she needs. But I do think she'll need a longer recovery. Emotionally, she's fragile." The word didn't fit me. Fragile. I built neural processors out of gene-edited bacteria. I worked 70-hour weeks. I had pitched to billionaires without blinking. I had never once been called fragile. I closed my eyes again, not to rest, but to hide. Something about the way he said it didn't sound like concern. It sounded like a decision already made. I spent the next 3 days in that bed under observation. Nurses were kind but distant. They wouldn't answer my questions directly. I asked for my phone, no one could find it. I asked for my assistant, she was on leave. I asked for Vivian, no response. Marcus came daily, not with flowers or food or comfort, just with updates. "The company's fine. We've postponed the board meeting. You don't need to worry about anything right now." But I did worry, because something didn't feel right. On the 4th morning, I tried to stand. My legs were rubber, but my mind was clearer. I asked a nurse again for my phone. She glanced at my chart and said gently, "Your husband asked us not to overwhelm you with devices. He said you get overstimulated easily." I stared at her. "I don't get overstimulated. I built a company from my bedroom floor. I debug code with 3 screens and a broken keyboard. I ran on caffeine and cortisol for 3 years straight. Overstimulated." That was Marcus's word. When he visited that evening, I asked him. Voice still hoarse, eyes sharper now. "My phone," I croaked. He smiled, sat on the edge of the bed like he used to when we were first dating back before business plans replaced conversations. "I'll bring it tomorrow. You're still recovering. Just focus on healing, okay?" I nodded, but the feeling sat heavy in my chest. By the 6th day, I insisted on being discharged. Against medical advice, as they put it. Marcus tried to stall, saying our apartment was under renovation, that maybe I should rest at a recovery center. That's when the alarm bells screamed. I refused. Back at the apartment, our apartment things were rearranged. My office door was locked. My files were gone. The whiteboard where I'd mapped out the next gene splice model was scrubbed clean. A single white orchid sat on the desk instead, wilting in filtered light. I checked the drawer where I kept my thumb drives. Empty. The server backup password I'd hidden in a physical journal, ripped out. I opened my laptop, it booted, but all work credentials were revoked. Access denied. I sat there staring at the blinking cursor on a screen I had once designed the firewall for. My fingers shook. Then I heard it Marcus on a call in the kitchen. His voice low-clipped. "She's home, but I've got it handled. The board's aligned. Legal's got the framework ready. If she pushes, we'll lean into the medical records." Pause. No, she doesn't know. She still thinks the accident was, well, an accident. I stepped back from the door before he could see me. My phone never reappeared. The one he eventually handed me had a different background, no messages, no apps. My old texts, gone. The last message I remember sending was to Vivian the night of the crash. Need to talk. Something's off with the Q4 pipeline numbers. Now it was erased. I opened my calendar. Meetings I never canceled gone. My name removed from invites. There was one folder still on the device. One lonely PDF. I opened it. Title: Voluntary Medical Leave of Absence. Ms. Alina Cortez. Signed, not by me. Underneath, another document. Neurogene Board Action Summary. Line 4: appointing Marcus Cortez as interim CEO during Alina's leave. Unanimous vote. There was no signature from me, but there was one forged to look like it. My breath caught. I stood in the hallway, the apartment unfamiliar. My home redesigned, my company reassigned, my trust weaponized. In the hallway mirror, I saw a reflection that didn't look like me. Bruised cheekbone hair tied back roughly hoodie that wasn't mine. My body had returned, but everything else had been reprogrammed. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window looking down at the city that kept spinning, unaware that somewhere in its glinting towers a woman had been silently erased. I thought of the early days, the floor of our apartment littered with prototypes, ramen containers, broken vials, and notebooks. I thought of the first time Marcus stayed up with me till 4 a.m. to debug a nano loop. I thought of the way Vivian once whispered, "We're going to change everything." And maybe we had, just not the way I thought. The silence wasn't just a pause, it was a plan. And I was no longer inside it. The first thing I noticed was the dust. Not on the shelves or the corners. Marcus had hired someone to clean while I was gone, no doubt. But the kind of dust that lives in silence. The kind that settles when no one touches a room for days. Or when they've removed everything worth touching. My office, the sanctuary where I drafted patents at midnight, whispered to prototypes written investor decks on no sleep, was gutted. The wall of whiteboards where I'd once mapped neural integration pathways now stood blank. My desk was empty. The glass dry erase markers I swore by gone. The stack of journals I kept beside the window erased. Even the ficus I'd been overwatering for 3 years absent. Like someone had pulled out not just my things, but the atmosphere. I stood in the doorway, heart pounding in a dull, heavy rhythm. It wasn't just a cleanup, it was a purge. I walked in slow, every step a question. I opened the lower cabinet where I kept the backup files encrypted locked, labeled in my shorthand. Only a few old cables and a crumpled post-it remained. No drives, no folders, no trace. The locked drawer where I kept my founding documents had been pried open, sloppy but effective. I ran my fingers across the splintered edge. My thumb caught on a sliver of metal still screwed into the wood. They hadn't even tried to fix it, just taken what they wanted and left the wound open. I stepped back, breath caught in my throat. I reached for my phone, the new one Marcus gave me. I typed in Vivian's number. It rang once, then again, then voicemail. I tried again. this time straight to voicemail. Vivian, my co-founder, my college roommate, the woman who stood beside me at every pitch for 5 years, who once covered a $14,000 equipment order on her personal credit card when our funding collapsed. Gone. I opened our old text thread. It was still there, but shortened. Empty. Only one message remained from months ago. Need you in Lab A at 9. Bring coffee. Everything else vanished. I scrolled up, down, side to side. I hadn't deleted them, but someone had. I pulled open my laptop. Tried to log into my company email. Denied. I tried another way in through the old dev shell I'd coded myself pre-launch. Denied. Even my personal Gmail gave me the spinning wheel of doom, followed by account suspended due to unusual activity. Please contact admin. Admin? Who the hell was the admin now? My hands trembled. I tried to reset the password. The recovery email had been changed. The recovery phone wasn't mine, and the security questions weren't questions I'd ever picked. Favorite author, Danielle Steele. I laughed. A bitter, hollow sound. Vivian hated Danielle Steele. I slammed the laptop shut. My chest was tight. But it wasn't panic, it was clarity. They weren't just locking me out. They were rewriting me. I turned back toward the window, the one that used to face the city, my version of a clock. I'd watched the skyline shift from steel to fire to night. My way of keeping track when time became blurred in code. Now it just showed reflections of a woman I didn't recognize. The phone buzzed in my hand. Unknown number. Voicemail, no ring. I pressed play. The audio crackled, a woman's voice low, clipped, cautious. Alina, I don't know how much longer I can stall. Marcus pushed it forward. The lawyer says everything's almost finalized. I just hope you don't find out too soon. I'm sorry, I really am. Beep! I dropped the phone on the floor. It bounced once, landed face up. That voice. Vivian, not a stranger, not an enemy. The voice I used to hear through the wall of our shared apartment in med school. The voice that once shook with joy the day we got our first seed grant. The voice that read out loud the first email from the Gates Foundation, trembling with disbelief. Now that voice was whispering betrayal in past tense. My knees gave out. I sat on the hardwood floor, knees to chest, forehead pressed to my hands. She's just scared, I whispered to no one. She's just scared. But I didn't believe it, because that voicemail wasn't recorded in fear. It was recorded in anticipation. Mong chi không phát hiện sớm. Hope you don't find out too soon. They weren't afraid of hurting me. They were afraid of me knowing. I stayed there for hours, or minutes. Time warped again like it had in the hospital. But this time not from trauma. From betrayal. Eventually I got up and pulled open a locked box under the bed. It was still there, one of the only things they hadn't touched. Inside a burner phone. I hadn't used it in 3 years. Only Juno and Vivian had the number. We used it back when we were trying to secure IP from offshore labs when leaks were happening too frequently. Paranoia back then felt like protection. Now it felt like prophecy. I powered it up. Battery held. 3 missed messages. 2 from spam, 1 from a private number, a text, dated the night before my accident. You were right. The Q4 data's off. They moved the funds. I'll try to cover. Talk tomorrow. No signature. But I knew it was Vivian. Tomorrow never came. Because tomorrow was the day my brakes failed on the expressway. I didn't cry, but something in me closed. Not like a door slamming. More like a vault sealing itself from the inside. Vivian was gone. Not kidnapped, not silenced, not coerced, complicit. And Marcus was patient. They had planned this, waited for my guard to drop, calculated the angle of my vulnerability, then struck. And here I was, back in the apartment I paid for, holding a phone I didn't trust, sitting in a company I no longer had access to. I walked to the balcony. The city pulsed below, alive and different. My voice was quiet, almost inaudible. I've never known anything colder than a whisper behind your back. Then I turned and started taking inventory of what they hadn't erased yet. Because I wasn't going to stay locked out. I was going to burn my way back in. The envelope came 2 days after the voicemail. Thick, cream-colored paper. My name printed in serif type, no return address. It slid under the apartment door like an omen, silent, undesired, impossible to ignore. I opened it at the kitchen counter, fingertips numb. Inside, a single sentence shattered everything. This letter confirms your voluntary decision to step down from your executive role at Neurogene, effective as of the medical advisory review submitted on your behalf. Voluntary. My breath caught. I reread the line, then again slower. Voluntary. But I had never signed anything. Never agreed. Never spoken those words. I flipped to the back. Signature line, Alina Cortez. It looked like mine. The angle of the A, the sharp curl on the Z, the pressure in the pen stroke. It mimicked my muscle memory so precisely I felt sick. Whoever did this hadn't forged it with guesswork. They had practiced, studied, or worse, copied from a past contract and digitally cleaned it. High-resolution forgery wrapped in legal legitimacy. I stood frozen. My own name no longer belonged to me. A second document was tucked behind the first. Title amendment to Founders Page and Corporate Registry. Line 3. Effective immediately. The corporate registry shall reflect Ms. Cortez as having temporarily relinquished authority due to mental health incapacity as certified by the attending physician. My heart stopped mid-beat. I gripped the edge of the counter. Mental health incapacity. They had used the hospital, the accident, the 11-day coma, the fog, the medication, the bruises, the trauma, and built their perfect trap. The doctor, the nurse, the fragile comments, Marcus's whispers in the hallway. It had all been set up, laid brick by brick while I slept in morphine silence. I flipped to the last page. The names of the board. All 5. Signatures crisp and present, including one from Vivian Chen. Vivian. Her handwriting had always been shaky in person, too fast, too messy, but here it was elegant, clean, purposeful. I dropped the pages. They scattered like leaves at my feet. The only sound in the apartment was the hum of the fridge and the quiet, ragged breath of someone whose identity had just been buried. I stumbled to the hallway, leaned against the wall. My legs barely held me. A dry laugh escaped my throat. Voluntary. I had poured 8 years of my life into building Neurogene from a bedroom lab with borrowed pipettes and secondhand servers. Worked through my father's funeral. Slept in the office. Ate saltines for dinner for 6 months. And now, in less than 2 weeks, I was gone. On paper, in press releases, in the archives of the company I'd created with my blood and breath. I tried calling the firm's legal hotline. The woman who answered was cordial but rehearsed. "I'm sorry, Ms. Cortez, but the file on record shows your acknowledgement of the transition. If there's been a misunderstanding, please direct your concern to the chief executive's office." Marcus's office. I hung up before she could say his name again. The walls of the apartment pressed in tighter. Every corner was rearranged, every memory coated in betrayal. Even the tea mug beside the sink, my favorite one with the molecular sketch, was missing. I couldn't stay there. I needed air. Shoes, jacket, keys. I barely remembered grabbing them. My feet carried me more instinct than choice. I walked 6 blocks without speaking to a soul, my phone a dead weight in my pocket. Not because the battery was low, but because the contact list had been scrubbed. No Juno, no Vivian, no CTO, no assistant, no engineers, just a hollow log of strangers and cold callers. My destination wasn't conscious until I stood in front of the building. A converted warehouse 2 stories high. No sign, just a keypad and a security cam dusty and angled wrong, the place we jokingly called the bunker. Lab B. It had started as an overflow space when our main lab was too cramped. A place for half-tested protocols and backup runs, but over time it had become mine. I ran side experiments here, worked through weekends here, locked myself in during particularly bad board weeks. No one else had the passcode, not even Marcus. I had insisted. Now it felt like the only untouched corner of my life. I punched in the code 4217. The door clicked. Inside the air was musty stale. The lights flickered for a moment before warming. Dust floated through amber light like memory. The hum of old freezers still buzzed from the back wall. Half-covered tables, laptops unplugged, no recent footprints. I walked past the rows of shelves, past the centrifuge, past the broken 3D printer I never bothered to repair, toward the storage fridge in the far corner, locked with a digital panel I had rigged myself. I typed the second passcode. Longer. A date the day I'd finalized our first neural mapping prototype. No one else remembered it, not even Vivian. She'd always mixed it up with our FDA milestone. The panel blinked green, unlocked. Inside one vial, silver-capped, cooled at -15, labeled with nothing but a date and my initials. Next to it, a wrapped USB sealed in vacuum plastic. My handwriting on a tag in case of silence. I reached in with shaking fingers. This was my insurance, my last untouched thread. 2 years ago, I'd begun encoding legal and genetic data into synthetic DNA strands. It was a proof of concept, then a radical way to store sensitive data biologically. Most people laughed when I presented the theory, said it was a gimmick, that no one would want a legal contract embedded in a genome sequence. But I did. Because paper burns, drives get wiped, clouds get hacked, but DNA survives. I sat on the cold floor of the lab, back against the wall, vial in one hand, USB in the other. The trap they built was airtight. They'd used my coma, my trauma, my trust. They'd signed documents with my stolen name. They'd removed me from the very idea of myself. They didn't even need to fire me, they erased me. But they'd missed this place. They hadn't found the lab with no sign, the lock with no record, the vial with no label. And they hadn't taken the one place I had hidden the blueprint of the truth. Not just data, proof. And I was going to use it, not to take back the title, but to take back my voice. They had taken everything but this. Not by oversight, by ignorance. They didn't know what this room meant because I never told them. Not Marcus, not Vivian, not the board, not even our CTO, who once jokingly said it looked like a janitor's closet with a god complex. To them, Room 3BS was overflow storage, a backup freezer, a few out-of-date microscopes, an old server rack that hadn't been connected in years, a relic. But to me it was everything. I returned at night, not late enough to raise suspicion, not early enough to get caught in lab schedules. I wore black, hair tied tight, no perfume. I parked 4 blocks away, used the maintenance entrance, still remembered the key code even though the system had likely been updated twice since my last visit. But they hadn't changed it. That told me something. That told me no one had tried to enter. Because no one remembered this room existed. I slipped inside the old lab wing, past the vending machines that never worked, past the door with the peeling nameplate that used to read Research D. And then there it was. Plain, silent. A beige steel door with a keypad below the handle and no signage. I entered the code, 6319. The click of the deadbolt was so soft it barely registered, like the room itself was holding its breath. I stepped in. The air was cold and still, not stale, preserved. The room was exactly as I'd left it, right down to the cracked tile beneath the sink and the coffee mug from an old AI conference still holding 3 petrified pens. On the wall, an ancient corkboard covered in notes pinned in my own handwriting, some so faded they looked like ghost scripts. The lights hummed low and uneven. To the right was the freezer silver square, unassuming. On the front, no label, no warning, just a fingerprint scanner half glitched. I reached out, placed my thumb flat on the sensor. A pause, then access granted. The door hissed open, releasing a breath of frost. Inside were 2 items. One, a small double-sealed biological chip suspended in sterile gel. to a stainless steel capsule about the size of a lipstick tube wrapped in a black nitrile glove. My fingers trembled when I picked them up, not from fear, from memory, because I remembered building this chip. Not for production, not for testing, not for fame, for insurance. It was encoded with a DNA strand, synthetic, triple-bound, unbreakable, containing the original founding contract of Neurogene line by line. Scanned, digitized, compressed, then stored in biochemical code. A piece of legal truth woven into strands of scientific rebellion. It wasn't just symbolic, it was binding. The chip was encoded with timestamps, authorship logs, signature lineage, and encryption keys that only matched my biometric input. No one else. Not Marcus, not Vivian, not any damn board member. This chip didn't just prove I was a founder, it proved they had stolen from me. And it proved it at the molecular level. I set the chip gently onto the metal tray beside the freezer, then lifted the capsule, twisted it open. Inside a single microdrive. Years ago, I had backed up experimental results, personal files, and meeting recordings onto that drive. Not the polished ones, the raw ones. The versions where Marcus muttered about diverting funds, where Vivian questioned timeline edits, where offhand remarks revealed intentions no PR team could bleach. I uploaded everything to a blank laptop I'd brought in a sealed bag. It wasn't connected to the internet. Not yet. Just clean hardware for a dirty truth. The chip slotted into a portable reader. The decryption took 3 minutes, which felt like an hour. I paced while it loaded, arms crossed, hard a war drum. Then the screen blinked. Line by line, the founding agreement appeared. My name, my contributions, my signatures. And below it, the amendments, dates, edits, all tracked, including the illegal overwrite made during my hospital stay. Logged-in code burned into biosequence. Irrefutable. A contract written in DNA. A record only a scientist would think to leave. I stared at the screen. They thought they could erase me, I whispered. But they didn't understand I am the source code. I scrolled deeper. Embedded within the sequence markers from our original gene therapy prototype. A fingerprint not just of me, but of our work. Of everything we built before the money came in, before the titles, before the sabotage. I had buried the truth in the one place they'd never think to look because they didn't understand the science. Not really. Not like I did. Marcus had charm, Vivian had polish, but I had origin. This chip wasn't just evidence. It was identity. And they couldn't redact what pulsed in the marrow of the company's creation. I backed everything up threefold. One on a new microdrive, one on a burner phone drive, one on a server stub Juno had built for me in the early days, buried under layers of obfuscation. When I was done, I sat back. The hum of the freezer filled the room, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't gasping for air. The betrayal was still there, the signatures forged, the board corrupted. But here in this unmarked room, I still existed. My voice hadn't vanished. It had been stored. I stood in the middle of the lab, hands clenched, chip in one pocket, microdrive in the other. And in my chest fire, they erased my title. They rewrote the filings, but they will never delete my origin. I turned off the light and shut the freezer. The click echoed softly behind me like a vault resealing. They had renamed departments. They had deleted emails. They had silenced the narrative. But they had left one door unlocked, and they'd regret it. Because memory, when encoded properly, never dies. It just waits, ready to become evidence. There was only one person I could trust with what I now held, and she hadn't used her legal name in over a decade. Juno, a ghost in the world of cybersecurity. Brilliant, antisocial, untraceable when she wanted to be. We met during Neurogene's chaotic first year, back when we ran everything on duct-taped code and startup adrenaline. She was 19. I was desperate. A bug had exposed our experimental DNA mapping software to the public cloud, and within hours, a European biotech firm was mirroring our structure. I called her then through a burner app I didn't fully understand. She scrubbed the attack in 17 minutes. left a firewall so elegant even our CTO couldn't decipher it. Her only fee permanent admin access and no questions asked. After funding rolled in, Marcus pressured me to cut her loose. She's unstable, he'd said. We're a legitimate company now. We can't be working with mercenaries. But I kept her line. Now I needed it. The old code still worked. An encrypted message buried in a code commit on a forgotten GitHub repository. I typed, Alina. Urgent. Deanna core breached. Ghost room still alive. I have the chip. They took everything. Need eyes on transfer logs. Now. The response came 23 minutes later. Meet me in 45. No tails, no phones, bring proof. I didn't waste time. She chose the basement of a defunct laundromat in Brooklyn, 3 blocks off Atlantic Avenue. No signage, no sound. A keycard reader still worked. She buzzed me in with a low click that echoed down a concrete corridor. The smell of bleach and damp tile wrapped around me like memory. The door opened and there she was. Still the same somehow. Black hoodie, combat boots, cropped hair dyed the color of rusted copper. Her hands were in fingerless gloves, tapping out code on a laptop balanced on a metal cart, surrounded by wires, monitors, and what looked like a functioning 3D printer disassembled mid-project. You look taller on Zoom, she muttered without turning around. I've never Zoomed you, I said. Exactly. She finally turned eyes scanning me. Not like a friend, like a threat assessment. You brought it! I reached into my bag and laid the microdrive, the chip, and a printout of the encoded genome string on the table. Juno picked up the chip, held it to the light. Triple sequenced, she asked. Yeah. She gave a low whistle. And here I thought you'd gone soft after FDA approval. This is art. I built it for insurance. Juno grinned without humor. Good call. Because, honey, they've buried you. She slid into her chair and started typing. Screens flickered, green code on black. Data streams opened, morphed, collapsed. She routed through back doors I had helped design, but only she had ever truly understood. Start talking, she said. Tell me what happened. I laid it all out. The accident, the hospital, the forged signature, the false declaration of incapacity. Vivian's voicemail. The stripped office, the legal letter, the chip, the room they didn't know existed. Juno didn't interrupt. She didn't nod or react, just typed. Then she froze. There she whispered. One screen went full-screen financial logs from the company's internal network. Juno had wormed in through an old vendor VPN account that hadn't been decommissioned. It showed timestamps, signatures, routing paths. She pointed. Marcus initiated an internal stock transfer 48 hours after your accident. Transferred your Class A shares 51% into a holding LLC called Revise Holdings, Inc. I felt sick. He legally can't, I whispered. Those shares are locked by founding agreement. They are non-transferable without my biometric sign-off. Juno nodded slowly. Which is why they forged a digital biometric key modeled off your last 3 signature approvals. She paused. It's almost perfect. Almost, I asked. She smirked. They used a synthetic signature engine built for market filings, not legal transfers. I can trace it. But it'll take time. How much time? Hours, maybe less. Depends on how sloppy they were with metadata. I exhaled, hands on my knees. She kept typing. Also, she said after a beat, Vivian logged into your founder registry the same night, deleted your profile, updated the narrative to temporary withdrawal due to wellness concerns. It was then pushed to the press archive. I closed my eyes. The betrayal echoed again, this time in code. Juno leaned back. This wasn't just theft. This was a coordinated erasure. I looked at her. Can you prove it? Already did, she said, pointing to another monitor. Digital logs, timestamps, IPs, unusual logins, version history. One file labeled Amendments Final Redacted DOF7 with a user ID tied to Marcus's executive assistant. This is enough to blow it open, I said quietly. She turned to me, tone sharp. No, this is enough to start. What do you mean? You need to control the story before they spin it. You go to the press with this, now they'll bury it under a NDA, or worse, make it look like you're unraveling. You need a plan. I nodded slowly. I want to hit them where it hurts. Good. Then let's build a digital kill shot. But not to destroy the company. She paused. To reclaim the truth. By the next morning, Juno had mapped out a forensic blueprint. Data trails from Marcus's transfers, Vivian's login history, cloud backups showing document deletions, all tethered to my name. Each node a piece of me they tried to sever. We stored everything in a decentralized data vault, then encrypted it into a time release packet. Just in case something happens to either of us, she said, slipping me a drive with a quiet finality. I asked her the one question I'd been holding since I stepped into the room. Why are you helping me? Juno didn't hesitate. You're the only one who ever treated me like a founder, she said, even when you didn't have to. I looked down at the drive in my hand, the weight of it strangely calming. Let's take it to the right journalist, I said. Already have someone in mind, she replied. Independent, smart, and pissed off about biotech consolidation. She won't be scared of them. As I stepped out into the early morning air, Brooklyn still half asleep around me, I felt something strange. Not triumph, not hope, something quieter, like the hum before a power surge. I wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. When you build something from scratch, when you bleed it into existence, you think people will remember. That's the lie. They don't remember. They recalculate. I spent 4 days walking into the offices of people who used to shake my hand and call me visionary. I had once toasted startup milestones with them stood under industrial lighting, holding champagne in plastic cups, sweaty and proud. I used to know their assistants' birthdays, their dogs' names. Now I couldn't even get past reception. Every meeting request was declined with regrets. Every hallway run-in came with stiff smiles, hollow nods followed by an email that read, "We're not in a position to comment on internal company structure." Doors that used to swing open at my name now locked at the sound of my steps. It wasn't just silence, it was choreography. I sat outside Hartwell Ventures for over an hour watching faces I once called allies walk in and out, pretending not to see me. I waited, and then when I just stood to leave, a voice behind me, soft, gruff, older. "Walk with me," he said. I turned. Alan Mora, late 70s, one of our earliest angel investors. He'd believed in our work before anyone else would take my pitch seriously. The man who once said, "You don't bet on the horse, you bet on the fire in her eyes." Now he walked beside me like he was being followed. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," he said plainly. "They sent a confidentiality update 2 weeks ago." They, I asked. Marcus, Vivian, legal, PR, everyone. We turned down a side street. Alan pulled out a flash drive. Tiny, black, taped. I shouldn't have kept it, but I did. He handed it to me. "What is it?" I asked, not daring to breathe. He looked me in the eye. "Marcus didn't just remove you. He sold your absence. Told investors you wouldn't come back. Couldn't. Said you weren't mentally stable enough to contest." I swallowed. Alan's voice dropped. He said, and I quote, "She won't be lucid long enough to fight us. The documents will be final before she figures out which way is up." I didn't realize I'd stopped walking. He said that I whispered. Alan nodded. "On a call. After he left the hospital. I record everything. Habit. Comes from too many bad exits." I felt the weight of the drive in my pocket like a detonator. "Why give it to me?" I asked. "Because you built it," he said. "And because even if the board forgot, I didn't." He turned, walked back the way he came, not waiting for thanks. I didn't move for a full minute. Back at my apartment, I plugged the drive into an air-gapped laptop. The audio file was short, 11 minutes, tinny, but clear. Marcus's voice smooth as ever. "She's gone. Trust me, gentlemen. This is best for all of us. Once the restructuring's done, we can pivot hard into the therapeutics vertical. No more delays, no more dreams about open access science. She was brilliant, yes, but unscalable." Silence, then laughter. Someone one of the investors probably asked, and she won't contest. Marcus again chuckling. Not unless she wakes up with a legal team, and by then we'll have it sewn shut. She won't be lucid long enough to fight us. My hands clenched into fists. The file ended, not with a bang, but with the rustle of papers and the clink of a glass being set down. I didn't cry, but I did something worse. I remembered everything. Every late-night board meeting. Every call I patched in while curled on my couch with the flu. Every time I gave Marcus the benefit of the doubt. Every time Vivian said, "Let me handle the wording, Alina. You don't want to sound too emotional." I opened my laptop again. I started digging, because if they were confident enough to lie about my mental state, they were confident enough to fabricate everything else. I began with the meeting logs. Nurajeen had a digital boardroom platform. I designed it myself with our dev team encrypted archival AI transcribed keyword indexed. Clean, trackable. I used to access it weekly. Now I was locked out. But Juno wasn't. She rerouted through an old server node, one we'd used in our Series A phase, and pulled a cached backup of the board minutes. They were altered. Not just summaries. Entire segments. Dates had shifted. Names omitted. In one entry, a vote was logged with unanimous consent, even though I remembered distinctly that I'd abstained. Juno ran a forensic compare. The original version, dated 5 days earlier, was still recoverable. It showed my objection. It showed Marcus overstepping. And it showed Vivian telling him, "We'll fix it in the archive." They had fixed it, over and over. Vote by vote, entry by entry. Bit by bit, they'd rewritten history. One line stood out like a wound. In the event of extended founder absence, voting control may be delegated to an active executive team. Not in the founding charter, not in our bylaws. A legal hallucination conjured by people who'd never written a single line of code or run a single trial at 3 a.m. with bloodshot eyes. They hadn't just removed me. They'd written a new story, and in it I didn't exist. I leaned back in my chair, the city glowing cold outside the window. My apartment, once a home, felt less like shelter and more like a command center now. They wanted me to believe I was isolated, but data remembers. And Alan hadn't forgotten, and Juno had never left. I opened a blank folder, titled it Truth. Inside, I saved the audio file, then the meeting logs, then the forgery metadata. And I wasn't done, because now I had proof, and soon I'd have their attention. They say the worst kind of predator is the one who smiles while they bite. Marcus always smiled, even when we argued, even when he lied. Even when he took things that weren't his, he wore that same polished expression like a man shaking your hand while slipping the watch off your wrist. So when I walked into the ballroom of the Halcyon Foundation Gala that night and saw him standing beneath the chandeliers laughing with a bourbon in hand, it didn't feel like fate. It felt like war dressed in velvet. I hadn't planned to attend. Juno had sent me the invite last minute. She'd found my name, my real name, on the archival donor list, not the new ones Vivian scrubbed. My credentials still opened the door even if they'd tried to close it behind me. I wore black. Not to blend in, but to be mistaken for someone forgettable. And yet he saw me the second I stepped onto the floor. Marcus always had a nose for control. He excused himself from a group of investors with practiced grace and moved through the crowd like gravity itself parted for him. Dark suit, crisp tie, one hand tucked in his pocket, the other holding his drink like it was an accessory, not a necessity. "Alina," he said, like we were still married, still partners, still something worth believing in. I didn't answer. "Wow, look at you," he continued. "You look sharp, strong, really bounced back, huh?" He smiled. The kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. I kept mine cold. "You shouldn't be here," he added, voice low enough that only I could hear. "I was invited," I said. He chuckled. "By whom?" "A journalist. A disgruntled intern." "Let me guess. Juno." That name on his tongue felt like blasphemy. He sipped his bourbon, then leaned slightly closer, his voice coated in silk and venom. I know what you're trying to do, Alina. You think you can rewrite the ending, but this isn't a movie. The board has moved on. Vivian's running strategy. I'm streamlining growth. It's over. You had your time. My jaw tightened. He didn't stop. We're doing what's best for the company and for you. Honestly, we protected your legacy. You should be thanking us. There it was, the full rot behind the veneer. He thought this was mercy. He thought theft, manipulation, and erasure could be rebranded as protection. He stepped back just enough to look me up and down. I'm glad you're okay, though. Genuinely, we were worried. I tilted my head, kept my voice level. Worried enough to forge a signature. His smile faltered, just for a breath. Then he laughed. You always had a flair for drama. Only when the truth demands it, I said. He glanced around, then leaned in again. Be careful, Alina. You don't want to make this messy. I stepped back. You already did, I said. I'm just making it visible. He blinked. The first crack. A twitch of muscle near the corner of his jaw. I didn't wait. I turned, walked past him, and left him standing there in that glittering ballroom filled with fake benevolence and curated smiles. Because I knew something he didn't. He still thought the battle was about who sat at the boardroom table. But I had learned. This was never about reclaiming the seat. It was about revealing the structure underneath. Outside, the night air was crisp and unapologetic. A breeze cut down 42nd like a warning. I paused beneath the stone archway, hands trembling from rage I refused to let bloom into weakness. I took out my phone. Juno had been watching the live stream from home. I texted her one word. He knows. 3 dots appeared. Good, let him. I exhaled. In a corner of that grand building, Marcus was likely laughing again. Smiling. Telling himself I wouldn't follow through, that I'd bluff posture fade. Because that's what men like him think women like me do. But he didn't know about the chip, or the audio files, or the logs Juno had pulled from under the floorboards of their pristine deception. He didn't know I had Alan's voice recorded, didn't know I had already spoken to 2 board members off the record who'd started to sweat under the pressure of compliance violations. Didn't know that I had printed, notarized, and quietly mailed key documents to a journalist with a habit of burning empires with nothing but footnotes and dates. And more importantly, he didn't know I no longer wanted back in. I wasn't trying to reclaim my throne. I was setting fire to the false kingdom built in my name. He thought the confrontation had ended in that ballroom. That he'd delivered his warning, flexed his narrative, and reasserted control. But what he didn't understand was this. Control dies in the dark, and I had just turned on the lights. I crossed the street, got in the waiting car, and pulled the door shut behind me. The driver didn't ask where to. I'd already sent the location. To the studio. Tonight I wasn't writing emails or filing paperwork or building quiet folders of truth. Tonight I was speaking. Into a camera. Unfiltered. Unforgiving. And absolutely unstoppable. The transfer logs weren't hidden. That's what made it worse. They were buried, sure tucked behind layers of consulting reports, third-party vendor line items, shell invoices with titles like market calibration analysis and board-aligned advisory panels. But they weren't encrypted. They weren't even anonymized. Because Marcus and Vivian never thought anyone would be looking. They assumed I'd stay erased, that I wouldn't find Juno, that no one would dare question the version of the story they'd carefully stitched together, the brilliant founder who'd burned out, whose absence was tragic but necessary, who had by her own decision stepped aside. But Juno looked. She never blinked. This isn't just sketchy, she said flatly, fingers flying across 3 screens. It's theft. She turned one monitor toward me. Rows of transactions lined up like dominoes, monthly payouts between $87,000 and $143,000 marked under executive consulting, all directed to firms with no active websites, no employee listings, no client trails. Each tied on back-end registry search to holding companies. Those holding companies registered to Delaware, Barbados, and Liechtenstein. She zoomed in on one name. Sywell Partners, LLC, owner of Record v. Chen, Vivian, and another, Bellwright Strategic. Registered Agent M. Cortez Holdings. Marcus. Juno didn't speak for a beat. Her screen flickered. Then she looked at me. $5.87 million in 18 months. Laundered through 3 consulting shells. All approved by the board based on amended policy you never signed. My throat went dry. They pulled it while I was unconscious, I whispered. Juno nodded. They didn't just steal your title, they siphoned the bloodline. I stood arms crossed tightly against my ribs like I could hold myself together with sheer pressure. I need it all. Dated, indexed, screen recorded. It's already being packaged, she said, but I sent the teaser file. I looked at her sharply. To who? Her mouth curled slightly. Someone who doesn't believe in mercy when billionaires break the rules. The article dropped 2 days later. No press release, no teaser. Just a headline, bold and brutal, placed quietly at the top of an investigative column known for cracking biotech giants in half. Did they steal her company while she slept? Underneath a black and white image of me taken years ago during our first trial announcement. In the photo, I was smiling, lab coat, half-buttoned, safety goggles pushed up like a crown. I looked proud. I looked real. The article was surgical. Founder Alina Cortez suffered a near-fatal car accident last spring. During her medical recovery, confirmed to be under sedation for 11 days, lead executives Marcus Cortez and Vivian Chen executed a series of restructuring moves that removed Cortez from all executive authority. It laid out the timeline like a trap diagram. My accident, the board vote, the forged signature, the shell companies, the transfers. Quotes from unnamed insiders said things like, "There was no transparency." One week she was on the schedule for a TED Talk. The next her name vanished from everything. And another, Marcus said she'd suffered a breakdown. But that didn't feel right. Screenshots followed emails. Account logins. Internal memos marked confidential. One of them had the subject line, "If the media calls, stay vague." It ended with a sentence that felt like a siren. In a statement provided by sources close to Cortez, her team is preparing to take legal action not to reclaim her position, but to reclaim the truth. Within hours, it was trending. Erased while unconscious. Cortez silenced. Founders don't fade. The reaction was immediate and feral. Comments flooded in by the thousands. Wait, they did. What? While she was in a coma? How do you steal a woman's company and call it restructuring? I knew something was off when her name vanished. Marcus Cortez is everything wrong with Silicon Valley in one haircut. And the one that caught me hardest. She built it. They buried her. And now she's back. Messages filled my inbox. Old colleagues, investors who'd stayed quiet, early employees I hadn't spoken to since Series A. Even interns from 5 years ago. Most of them started the same way. I'm sorry. And then, what can I do? I sat at my kitchen table, phone in one hand, staring at the screen, as if it had turned into something living. The names, the messages, the threads, they weren't apologies. They were returning memory. People hadn't forgotten me. They'd just been waiting for permission to remember. Juno called. They're scrambling, she said. Marcus's team tried to kill the article within 6 hours. Their PR rep threatened to sue the platform. Editor told them to go ahead, said they had source documents, legal review, and 3 backup files from us. I let out a slow breath. Vivian's private accounts are being locked down as we speak, Juno added. One of the shell firms just went dark, deleted its website. Bad move. Now it's evidence of obstruction. I stood up and walked to the window. The city shimmered below, unaware it was about to be the stage for something far more public than it wanted. They were hoping I'd come back quietly, I said. You didn't, she replied. I turned. And we're just getting started. In a boardroom on the other side of Manhattan, I imagined Marcus reading the article, his carefully engineered empire groaning under the first real pressure. I imagined him texting Vivian, jaw-tight eyes, scanning for a way to spin this. But there would be no spin, because the network had started to crack, and they had no idea how deep the fault line ran. Not yet. The studio was dim, but warm, soft panels of acoustic foam lining the walls. A single ring light diffused above the mic, casting just enough glow to outline the shape of my face, not define it. It was perfect. No makeup team, no corporate handler, no agenda. Just a chair, a mic, and my voice finally unmuted. The producer gave a thumbs up through the glass. A red light blinked on above the door. We were live. The host, Riley Ainsworth, leaned in slightly across from me. She'd made a name for herself, tearing apart whitewashed narratives with nothing but a voice recorder and a lawyer-proof conscience. She didn't waste time with preambles. "Alina Cortez," she said, her voice like velvet over steel. "There's a lot of noise out there right now, but this is your first time speaking publicly about what happened. So let's start where they tried to end you the moment you woke up in that hospital bed." I didn't hesitate. It wasn't the wires or the pain or the light that hurt, I said. It was realizing the people I trusted most had already moved on. Riley nodded slowly. "You're talking about your husband, Marcus Cortez, and COO Vivian Chen." "Yes," I said calmly. "And the rest of the board. But it started with them. You were declared temporarily unfit to lead. Your name was removed from the registry." What did that moment feel like? I didn't blink. Erasure. But more deliberate than that. Not a mistake. Not a drift. A choice. They didn't just take my seat. They rewrote the table's existence. Made it as though I'd never carved it in the first place. Riley paused. "Some would say that's a bold accusation." "Facts aren't accusations," I said. "They're just inconvenient for the people who profit from silence." There was a brief stillness, not awkward, reverent. The soundboard engineer shifted in her chair behind the glass, her eyes fixed on me like she wasn't just recording. She was listening. Riley leaned forward. "Tell me about the chip." So I did. I told them about the nameless lab room, the DNA-encoded signature contracts, the buried metadata, the forged transactions, the synthetic biometric signature. I told them about the file Alan gave me. The audio of Marcus saying I wouldn't be lucid long enough to fight back. I told them everything chronological, unflinching, unpolished. My voice never cracked. It didn't need to. It wasn't grief I was holding back. It was precision. Riley nodded slowly as I finished laying out the architecture of the betrayal. "And what do you want now?" she asked. "Is this about getting your company back?" I let that question hang in the air for a moment, long enough to gather all the noise, the speculation, the headlines, the rumors that had tried to define me these past few weeks. Then I answered, quiet but sharp. "I'm not here to reclaim a throne." I looked into the mic, not at Riley, not at the engineer, not at the walls, but through it to the thousands of ears on the other side, and the millions who would hear it tomorrow. "I'm here to make sure the truth makes it into the historical record," I said. "They can keep the crown, the press coverage, the glass towers, but the truth belongs to no one. And I'm not asking to be written back into the story. They already did that when they stole it." Riley sat back, breath shallow. I have to say, she whispered half off mic, "I've interviewed a lot of people who've been betrayed. None of them sound like you." I looked at her. "That's because I'm not here to cry. I'm here to correct the record." The red light above us blinked again, 2 short beeps. The end of our window. Final segment. Riley cleared her throat. "Last question." I nodded. "If you could say one thing to Marcus and Vivian right now with nothing edited, no lawyers, no filters, what would it be?" I let the quiet stretch for a full breath, and then another. Then I leaned in. "I hope one day you tell your children the real version of this story, because I promise you I will." The red light turned off. Silence filled the room. And then applause from the booth, from the hallway, from behind the glass. Not performative, resonant. Riley leaned over, whispering, "They're not ready for what you just did." I stood, removed the headphones gently, and took one last look at the mic. It had recorded everything, and this time it belonged to me. The letter arrived not in a manila envelope or via overnight courier, but by email, cold, sterile, unsigned. Subject line: notice of extraordinary general meeting time, 9:00 a.m. Location: Neurogene headquarters, 38th floor conference hall, B dress code. Business formal. Attendance mandatory for board members, optional for general shareholders. Final line. Ms. Cortez may attend in observer capacity. Observer. They wanted me in the room, just not at the table, not with a voice, not with a vote. But they wanted me there. And that meant they were scared, because the ground beneath them had started to quake. Not just because of me, but because the public had turned, because the markets had noticed, because too many emails had leaked, because one too many advisors had asked the wrong question at the wrong time. In response, Marcus did what he always did, fabricate calm. He released an internal bulletin titled, "Maintaining Forward Momentum." In it, he wrote, "We understand there has been some concern surrounding recent media coverage. Please rest assured that leadership is aligned and committed to our long-term strategy. While we understand the complexities surrounding transitions, Neurogene remains in capable hands." Founder Emeritus Alina Cortez has been invited to attend the upcoming board session as a valued historical contributor. Historical contributor. They couldn't kill me, so now they'd rebrand me. Vivian sent a follow-up memo of her own, only 4 sentences long, laced with condescension. Please refrain from engaging with speculative narratives or unauthorized interviews. HR will be monitoring all internal communication channels for compliance. We remain grateful for your discretion. Translation: stay quiet, stay loyal, or stay out. The day of the meeting I wore navy. No power red, no corporate armor. Just a quiet, sharp dress with clean lines and the cufflinks my father gave me the day I filed Neurogene's Articles of Incorporation. They were shaped like double helixes. Tiny, silver, unshakable. I didn't walk in alone. Juno was beside me, hoodie traded for a dark-tailored blazer laptop slung cross-body like a silent weapon. Her badge read, "Legal Tech Support." No one stopped her. Behind us, my lawyer, Dana Quinn, expression calm, folder thick with evidence. And one more. The journalist, Riley Ainsworth. She had every right to be there. She was now a minor shareholder. I'd sold her 0.01% for $1 the night before. Observer rights came with a lens. The elevator ride to the 38th floor was silent. No one made eye contact. But in the conference room they looked. Marcus was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by Vivian, and a rotating cast of board members who didn't meet my eyes. The projector was prepped, the slide deck already loaded. He looked up as we entered, eyes narrowing just slightly before smoothing over with that trademark smirk. "Alina," he said, nodding as if we were old colleagues at a networking brunch. I took the seat they'd labeled for me, far corner, no nameplate. Juno sat up beside me, placing her laptop quietly on the table, not opening it yet. Dana stood near the wall, flipping through documents without looking rushed. Riley took the chair by the back exit phone set to silent stylus ready. Marcus cleared his throat. "Thank you all for joining on such short notice. We understand that clarity is important during moments of transition." Transition. They still thought this was PR, a hiccup, a reshuffling. Vivian clicked to the first slide. A bland overview of Q3 progress, metrics, growth, pipeline projections. Juno's eyes met mine briefly. She didn't say a word. Because she didn't have to. I knew what was coming. Slide after slide painted a picture of calm. Until one number flickered. 5.87 million in consulting disbursements. A pause. Marcus tried to skip it. "We've undergone restructuring to remain agile in our advisory partnerships. These costs reflect a forward-thinking expansion model." Juno stood up, calm, unhurried. "Actually," she said, "they reflect illegal disbursement of shareholder funds to ghost LLCs registered in offshore accounts." All eyes turned. Dana stepped forward. "As legal counsel to Ms. Cortez, we are here not to observe but to document." Vivian froze. Marcus stood jaw clenched. "You don't have speaking rights." "Neither did she," I interrupted, voice steady. "But that didn't stop you." I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. Dana handed copies to each board member. Riley pressed record on her stylus mic. In that room under ceiling lights and boardroom air, I watched faces pale, receipts, signatures, time-stamped deletions, the original founding document, my DNA-encoded contract, Marcus's voice on tape laughing, "She won't be lucid long enough to fight us." I didn't yell, I didn't weep, I just watched them read. Because this wasn't the moment I took power back. This was the moment they realized I never left. And as silence crushed the room like gravity, I leaned forward and said simply, "Observer, yes. Silent, no." The network had cracked. Now it was going to break. The lights dimmed in the conference hall as Juno walked to the front, not hurried, not theatrical, just certain. She plugged in her drive. The screen flickered, and then a ripple of color, a swirl of lines, what looked like a constellation. But it wasn't stars. It was money. "Good morning," she began, voice even. "What you're looking at is a real-time visualization of capital flow from Neurogene operating accounts to offshore firms in the Cayman Islands, the Isle of Man, and a few others. These are not consulting firms, they're shells, and they're owned by Marcus Langford and Vivian Coury." Murmurs erupted. Chairs shifted. Hands reached for pens. No one looked at Marcus. Not yet. Juno zoomed in. Dates, names, routing codes, even login locations. Each transfer coincides with a board meeting you weren't invited to, Ms. Cortez. And each disbursement was authorized using credentials forged using your digital certificate revoked the day you were admitted to the hospital. Then she clicked once more. On the screen appeared an image, Alina's original DNA-encoded contract, decoded, time-stamped, and digitally fingerprinted. "No one else in this room could have created this file," Juno added. "No one else had access to this level of encryption." "This contract predates the forged withdrawal forms Marcus submitted." Vivian's hand covered her mouth. Dana stepped forward again. "This is legal proof of fabrication, fraud, identity manipulation, and hostile usurpation of corporate authority." At the head of the table, Marcus stood slowly. He looked like a man trying to remember which version of the story he'd told last. "Let's not be dramatic," he said, chuckling a hollow, sharp sound. "We're all professionals. Clearly there have been miscommunications." A beat, then two. He looked to the chairman. "Perhaps a recess. We should reconvene after legal has—" "Sit down," someone muttered. It was one of the board members, old, quiet, but firm. Marcus hesitated, and in that hesitation he broke. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. He just walked. Out the side door, past the projection, past Alina. He didn't look at her. He didn't dare. Vivian stayed. She didn't move. Didn't breathe, it seemed. But as Juno closed the presentation, Vivian's composure, her carefully chiseled executive grace fractured. One breath, then a blink, then, "I didn't want it to go that far," she whispered, barely audible. "He said it was temporary, that it was just until she got better." Alina watched her, not with triumph, not with pity, but with silence. Vivian turned away from the screen, her eyes filling fast. "We were building something. I didn't think we were burning it." The chairman cleared his throat. "Motion on the floor," he said, voice tight formal. "To vote for immediate removal of Marcus Langford and Vivian Coury from the executive board of Neurogene, effective immediately pending legal action." Hands raised, one by one, then all at once, every single hand, and then the second motion. To reinstate Alina Cortez as founder and historical architect, and to re-enter her name into all historical documents and founding charters of this corporation. Another wave of hands, faster this time, not just agreement, recognition. Juno looked over at Alina. Dana exhaled. Alina didn't smile. She stood. She walked to the front of the room, her footsteps quiet but firm. Her presence no longer questioned, only felt. And she said nothing for a moment, just stood in front of the screen, in front of the men who doubted her, the women who stayed silent, the papers that erased her. Then finally, "I'm not here to reclaim a throne, I'm here to correct the record." A beat. This company was born in a garage with $6,000, and a promise I made to my dying mother that no one else would die waiting for a diagnosis. She turned slowly, facing them all. Somewhere along the way, we traded ethics for ego, vision for valuation. That ends today. Another pause. You'll never find my name in the headlines again, not because I disappeared, but because I no longer need to be seen to lead. She walked off the dais, past the broken parts of her past, and this time every eye followed her. Not as a fallen founder, but as a woman who rewrote the end of her own story. The boardroom was quiet after the vote, a strange hush that always follows the fall of power. No one dared speak first, not even the chairman. It was as if every mouth waited for permission to speak, from the woman they'd once erased. Alina remained still, hands clasped, as the moment hung heavy in the air. Then the chairman leaned forward, his voice cautious but rehearsed. Ms. Cortez, in light of today's vote and the recognition of your founding authority, the board would be honored to reinstate you as CEO of Neurogene, effective immediately. There were nods, some eager, others nervous, apologies hovering just behind tight smiles. Alina looked at them one by one. Then she shook her head. No. A pause. I didn't come back for the title, she said, steady. And I didn't fight to reclaim something that was poisoned. She turned toward the wide windows behind the board table. Beyond them, the city shimmered under a gray afternoon light. Alive, moving, free. I gave Neurogene everything I had. My 20s, my health, my trust. It took me almost dying to realize that giving more would just be surrendering to what broke me in the first place. Someone shifted, someone else dropped a pen. She kept going, softer now, but no less powerful. I don't want to return to a table where betrayal was ever an option. Outside the building, the wind had picked up. Alina walked alone through the glass lobby, the echo of her heels chasing behind her like the last trace of the girl who once stood in that space with hope in her throat. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. Because what waited ahead wasn't a rebuild, it was something new entirely. 3 weeks later, the press gathered in a small conference room at the edge of the city. No gilded stage, no velvet banners, just a single podium, a white wall, and a name printed behind her in clean serif font: Founder. Alina stepped up, no makeup, hair tied back. The light hit her face straight on, unfiltered. I've been asked a lot of questions these last few weeks, she said. Why I didn't sue, why I didn't take back the company, why I disappeared again. She took a breath. And the answer is, I didn't disappear. I evolved. Murmurs, pens scratched, recorders clicked. Found Her isn't a company. It's not a foundation. It's a defense line, a shield, a loudspeaker, a place where women who've been written out of their own stories can come to rewrite them. She nodded once toward the first row where a woman in a black blazer wiped a single tear. It's for the co-founder who got replaced right before the IPO. For the scientist whose data was stolen by her advisor. For the architect whose firm bore her name until a man trademarked it behind her back. Her voice broke only once. I created Neurogene to save lives. Now I've created Found Her to save voices. Silence followed. Then an eruption of applause that didn't feel performative but earned. Back at her apartment, Alina stood at her kitchen counter stirring tea in a chipped ceramic mug, the one her mother had once sent her after her first Series A round. She looked out the window at the street below, unremarkable, ordinary, and smiled. Behind her on the wall in a simple black frame hung the decoded DNA contract. She never framed her diplomas. But this was the document no one could forge. This was her name encrypted in her own blood, her own brilliance. This was the proof that even when the world tries to delete you, you can still come back. Not to belong, but to build something no one can take again. It started with a headline: Former Neurogene CFO Marcus Thorne under criminal investigation. Then came the subhead: allegations include financial fraud, forged contracts, and unlawful removal of a founder during incapacitation. The article spread like wildfire on LinkedIn feeds, business blogs, and the front page of the New York Journal. A name that once commanded confidence now invited scrutiny, disgust, and disbelief. Marcus was seen leaving his luxury condo surrounded by federal agents. No cuffs yet, but the sight was enough. Cameras caught him looking down, lips tight, not a single word spoken. For the first time, he had no control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Vivian appeared in a quiet legal office downtown, flanked by her attorney. She looked different, less polished, smaller somehow. Her hands trembled slightly as she signed the cooperation agreement. A deal to trade partial immunity for full disclosure. She turned over email logs, payment trails, internal memos, everything. When asked why, she said only one sentence: "I couldn't keep defending the wrong person just because I was scared to be the right one." The prosecutors didn't nod. They didn't smile. But the recording went on file. And then came the documentary. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have sweeping music or dramatic voiceovers. Just real footage, real facts, real voices. Titled The Invisible Founder. It traced the timeline of a visionary woman who built a biotech empire from scratch, the strategic disappearance of her legal identity, and the blueprint for a modern corporate coup. But what made people stop scrolling was the footage of Alina's podcast. Raw, quiet, human. "I remember lying in that hospital bed," she said, "and realizing silence can be manufactured. You just need enough people agreeing not to listen." The film ended with the host looking into camera. "If we can engineer the removal of a founder using paperwork and power, we can engineer a world where that's no longer possible." Hashtags began to bloom like wildfire across social media. Not erased. Founder Alina was always there. Thousands shared stories. An engineer whose patent was reassigned to her male co-founder after maternity leave. A Black founder whose investors pressured her to step down for better optics. A designer who watched her CEO title vanish when the money got real. Alina didn't respond to all of them, but she read each one, sometimes with tears, sometimes with rage, always with resolve. The Department of Corporate Ethics launched a special commission. Alina's Law, they called it informally, a policy proposal requiring independent medical evaluation and founder consent in cases of corporate transition during medical leave. Marcus, now formally charged, hired the most expensive crisis PR firm in the country. It didn't matter. The narrative had moved on without him. The world didn't want redemption arcs from villains. It wanted power given back to the voices that built everything. One night, Alina received a message from a 17-year-old girl in Mexico City who had started a robotics club and had been voted out by the boys when the team got sponsored. The message was short. "They said I was too emotional to lead, but I saw your story, and now I'm building something they can't take." Alina stared at the screen, then closed her laptop, leaned back, and whispered to the dark, "That's it, that's why." Because justice doesn't always come in courtrooms. Sometimes it starts as a spark in someone else's chest. The apartment was smaller than her old one. No marble floors, no tech-controlled ambient lighting. Just hardwood that creaked a little when she walked barefoot, and sunlight that slid across the floor without permission. Alina opened the old drawer, the one with the lock that had long stopped working, and pulled out a manila envelope stained at the corner with old tea. The handwriting across it was faded but familiar. "For when you feel erased," her father's words. She hesitated before sliding the letter out. The paper had yellowed, creased from years of folding, but the ink still held. It always did. "Alina, if you're reading this, it means someone somewhere thought you weren't meant to continue. Maybe they took your keys. Maybe they took your name. Let them. You come from a line of makers, not owners. You don't need a title to lead or permission to build. If they take the thing you created, build a better thing, louder, freer, and with no doors to shut people out. And if one day your voice shakes, know it's just the echo of mine still trying to speak through you. Love you endlessly, Dad. She read it 3 times. By the 4th, her tears had soaked through his name. In her new office, bare walls, no logos, no boardroom tables, she took the letter and placed it in a simple black frame, right next to the window, so the morning sun would always hit it first. She also placed something else beside it, a photograph, faded and cracked. Her father in his lab coat holding her as a toddler, both grinning like they'd discovered a secret only they could understand. A knock at the door. One of her interns, just 19, poked her head in. Sorry, Ms. Cortez. We've got a Zoom with a group of women in Nairobi who want to replicate the founder model locally. Alina smiled, wiping her eyes quickly. No titles in here, she replied. Just Alina. The girl nodded and disappeared. She stared at the frame again. There had been a time years ago when her father had warned her, they'll try to outvote you with politeness, strip you with procedure. Don't let them. She hadn't listened then. Not fully. She had tried to play fair, to play by the rules. But now, standing in a space without gold plaques or leather chairs, Alina realized something. Her father had never been angry that he'd been shut out of his lab. He was angry that he'd stopped believing he could make another. She wouldn't make that mistake. She would always make another. She looked out the window, watched the clouds drag light across the rooftops of a city that once almost devoured her. And beneath her breath, she said, "Let them take my chair, I'll build a bench." No one heard it, except maybe the man in the photo. And maybe every daughter who ever needed to read a letter like his. The room smelled like soldered circuits, instant coffee, and hope. Whiteboards leaned against every wall, scribbled in 3 languages and at least 5 different styles of handwriting. Laptops hummed. One corner buzzed with a prototype still blinking red because no one had figured out what green even meant yet. Alina stepped into the room. She wasn't wearing a lab coat. Not today. She'd stopped dressing for symbols. But her presence, her calm, made the chatter, dim eyes lift, shoulders straighten. The group looked up from their workstations, 8 women, none older than 26. Some wore hoodies, some wore silk. One wore safety goggles as a headband. All of them had the same spark behind the eyes. They weren't waiting to be invited. They were already building the house. Alina laid the thin black drive onto the center table. Its casing was worn like it had survived a war, and in a way it had. This, she said, is every line of code, every DNA sequence, every molecular chain from the day I started the Biopulse project. The version that never saw the light of day. One of the girls, Zuri, reached out but hesitated. You want us to? Alina nodded. Make it better, make it unstoppable, and make sure your names go first. There was a silence not of fear but of weight. Then Zuri smiled, with pleasure. Later, under the harsh white lab lights, they circled a wide touchscreen panel. Bio-animations danced like constellations across the surface. One of them made a correction. Another expanded a sequence. A third adjusted a compound with a flick of 2 fingers. Alina stood behind them, not as a supervisor, not as an icon, but as soil under their feet. A girl named Thalia leaned over and whispered, "We've never had someone give us their life's work like this," Alina replied without turning. "It was never mine. Not entirely. It was meant to go further than me. I was just the ignition." A sudden laugh from across the lab. One of the new team had run a simulation and it worked. Cheers erupted. Someone cranked music from an old speaker, and for a moment it wasn't a lab. It was a revolution in a garage disguised as a slumber party. Alina let it all play out. She picked up her tablet and opened a note she'd written months ago. It read, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who you lift forward." She added one more line, and today they flew. Outside the Found. Her building, the city lights blinked like 1,000 questions waiting to be answered. And inside, under white light and louder music, a new kind of science was being born. Not one made in fear of being erased, but one made by those who refused to be forgotten. And it started right there with women who would never again ask for permission to exist. The hallway was silent. Even the hum of electronics from the lab had faded, replaced by the soft breath of evening settling through the ventilation ducts. Fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly less from voltage, more like a whisper from the walls. The world outside was still turning, still breaking and mending. But in this moment, time obeyed Alina Cortez. She stood at the threshold of the last room. Not the biggest, not the newest, not even the cleanest, but the one she had chosen to leave untouched, unbranded, unnamed. No signs, no logos, just a brushed steel door with a faint reflection ghostly soft. Her own face dimmed and duplicated. She didn't knock. There was no need. The room was hers, not because she claimed it, but because she earned the right to walk in and walk out with no permission required. She stepped inside. It was small. Enough space for 2 chairs, a lamp, and a long wooden table scuffed at the corners. One wall held a single photograph, her father at age 30, crouched beside a microscope, with a grin like he knew he'd been cut out of the patent, but not the legacy. There were no trophies, no awards, no gold-plated Woman of the Year titles, only stacks of empty notebooks neatly arranged, and one pen, black ink. Alina walked to the far wall and ran her hand along a grainy indentation, an outline where a corporate plaque had once hung. She'd had it removed months ago, not out of shame, but because a name isn't something you bolt to a door. It's something you become when the door stays open for someone else. Her voice came in soft over the scene. I used to think victory meant reclaiming everything they took from me, my title, my shares, my name. She paused, breath audible. Not broken, just real. But now I know. Some things were never theirs to take. And some doors once opened don't need to close behind you. She sat down at the table, flipped open the first notebook. The page was blank, and she smiled. Outside the door, a faint knock. Then the murmur of young voices, one of the new mentees. Alina didn't move to answer right away. Instead, she walked back to the threshold. Not to shut the door, but to touch it. At eye level, where a company sign might have gone, was a simple brass plate. Thin, brushed, hand-engraved, not factory-made. Just 6 words. For those who were erased, but never forgotten. She stepped out into the hallway. Behind her, the light in the room stayed on. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. Her legacy wasn't in the chair she left empty. It was in the footsteps she'd made walking away from it. Final voiceover. I don't need a room named after me, as long as the ones after me remember who turned the key first. Fade to black, and the echo of a latch softly closing, but never locking.